Hey everyone, appreciate folks tuning in and participating in this discussion with me. My name is Fernando Figueroa. I'm with the Central Committee of the Road Socialist Organization. I live here in Jacksonville, Florida. I've been part of the organization for about 11 years now, of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, I'm a rank and file trade unionist, but I began my political activist career and studying socialism back in college, back at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Now, I read a lot of books in college. Some were good, some were bad, and very few books struck me as important and as useful as Lenin's favorite work or famous work, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Lenin wrote this pamphlet back in 1918, but as I'll go through this discussion, we'll talk about today. I think the lessons continue to apply today and remain very useful to organizers and activists in 2020. So I'm assuming folks listening to this discussion have a background in the basics of socialism and maybe some activist experience, but I still think it's important to talk a little bit about the people this book discusses. Lenin, as I'm sure many of you know, was a famous Marxist theoretician who helped organize the Bolshevik Party and lead a successful revolution in 1917 Russia. Kautsky was a very interesting figure, not unlike some people out there today. Some of Kautsky's ideas near the beginning of his political career were good and helpful, and this in part led to many at the time recognizing Kautsky as a leading Marxist philosopher following the death of Marx and Engels. A lot of people looked at him as the quote-unquote successor to Marx and Engels, inheriting a lot of their work and their activity after they passed. Kautsky was active in the Second International, where he began to take some rather poor positions with regards to the politics of his day and his attitudes towards the First World War and so on. So in Lenin's pamphlet that we're discussing today, it's a response to a pamphlet Kautsky wrote about the dictatorship of the proletariat, a pamphlet which heavily criticized the fledgling Soviet government and the strategy and tactics of the Bolsheviks, the newly born Soviet Union. This left criticism of the Bolshevik methods and of the Soviet state is something we're going to focus on heavily during this discussion. So Kautsky engages in a lot of sophistry or empty rhetoric instead of using clear political terminology to make the Soviet Union look as bad as possible. For example, he spends a lot of time talking about pre-socialist democracy and comparing it to democracy in the Soviet Union. Anybody who's read Lenin's pamphlet on the state and revolution knows that there are really only two kinds of democracy, just like there's two kinds of states, bourgeois democracy and working class or proletarian democracy, just like there's bourgeois states and workers' states. And this is one of the main ideas at the heart of Marxist-Leninist theory and something that has a lot of application today. You know, there's two kinds of governments. Governments run by the rich and governments run by the 99%. So I've got a question for my socialists out there. Have you ever heard someone talk about socialism being good in theory, but bad in practice, or good on paper, bad in real life, bad in action? In my opinion, Kautsky was one of the main voices infecting the left at the time with these sorts of ideas. And he does so largely by repeating bourgeois. I knew a lot of anarchists and Trotskyists. And I remember having a lot of these same debates time and time again about things like the Spanish Civil War, the class nature of the Soviet Union and China, and whether or not Cuba was socialist, things like that. And I remember having these debates while at the same time I was engaging in a lot of local organizing around my college, around my community, and having similar debates about the very campaigns that we were actually working on, whether it was fighting for farm worker justice, protesting police crimes, police brutality, protesting the wars overseas, and all that kind of stuff that we organize as activists in our community. And I began to see a lot of Kautsky's ideas, whether consciously or more often than not unconsciously, embedded in a lot of these arguments I was hearing from the other side of the debate. And slowly but surely, this realization helped to sharpen my own analysis and helped me to figure out how to promote the right line on things and what the right thing to do was at different junctures. Whether we should march in the streets or on the sidewalk, whether we should occupy the administration building or sit outside blocking the doors. Things like that, questions that activists encounter every day when they're out there organizing and marching. And my analysis almost always boiled down to one question, and that was a question of power and whose power was dominant. Kautsky, in his pamphlet, was looking at a state run by the working class with help from allies and calling it an abomination and all sorts of things. And I look at the movement that has a large mixture of good and bad ideas and saw possibilities and saw hope. So we can fast forward to today's world and the big movements we see out there in the streets right now, from the fight for Black Lives Matter and the struggle against police crimes, to the terrible conditions of the immigration camps, to the state of trade unions or the student movement. Everywhere we look, everywhere there's activism and organizing going on, we see critics on the sidelines with a lot to say about how the movement is doing this or that wrong. But they don't really provide a lot of in-depth analysis of how they're really doing a lot of things right. And whenever I hear this, I hear Karl Kautsky's words, whenever someone's criticizing a BLM rally for doing this or that, yet leaving out the consistent violence we see from the police and from the ruling class, the police being a primary armed wing of the state. I see it whenever I hear people criticizing any protest, any movement we see out there in the streets. And the fact is this, when you're out there struggling in the streets, whether you're fighting for justice and making gains, there's always going to be those who claim to be supportive of the movement that are sitting on the sidelines criticizing you. That should ring a bell for a lot of folks out there. You know, you're out there, you're protesting, but there's people on the sidelines that say, oh, I support you, but you did this wrong, or I support this movement until it got violent, or I think this movement started off on the right foot, but then got derailed by bad protesters or bad elements or things like that. And this is a lot like how Kautsky criticized Lenin instead of supporting the first large-scale successful workers' state. And so the pamphlet that Lenin wrote in response serves to kind of immortalize this struggle between the naysayers and the people actually out there doing this thing. It immortalizes the struggle and proves that history is on the side of the working class, on the side of the oppressed. History is not a judge that favors the ruling class and laments whenever an imperfection arises in the people's movement, whether that imperfection is real or imagined. And so whenever I hear these criticisms, I ask myself, are my actions supporting the working class and oppressed peoples, or are my actions supporting the status quo of the ruling class? And so by answering this question, you can navigate a lot of intersections and arrive at the correct conclusions, the conclusions that support the 99%. Socialism, I believe, lives in what we do, not in what others think. And our movements have value insofar as they advance the cause, as they're out there struggling. They don't have value based on whether or not they live up to the ideals in somebody else's head. No one knows what the cake is going to look like until it's done baking, sort of thing. So socialism in practice is based on theory. It's not to win or to get there. It exists in the actions that we take, in the theory that we learn, and that's why that nugget of truth is so important, that we practice a process of learning theory, applying it, and then reevaluating the theory and trying to add to it. You know, that's really what's at the heart of creatively applying something like Marxism, Leninism to the people's movements in the United States today. That struggle, that seeing what actually plays out in real life and using that to determine how we've done. That's why we don't just have a protest and then go back and read some old Russian or Chinese pamphlets to see if the protest was successful, going through and ticking off this or that on the checklist. We analyze it insofar as, did it advance the workers' struggle? Did it advance the people's struggle of oppressed people all over the world? Or did it serve the 1% in the ruling class? I think that's really the heart of what we do. And I think that's why this pamphlet is so important, because Lenin uses that victory, that real life experience, to sort of negate these critics on the sidelines that are saying, oh, the Soviet Union wasn't really socialist, China's not really socialist, Cuba's not really socialist, etc. He's saying, no, socialism doesn't exist in these books from the past. It exists in the here and now and what people are doing and what they're practicing. That's the best guide for knowing what socialism is. And I believe that that's the best guide for knowing if your activism is successful or if it needs some work. So I hope if you've had a chance to read through the Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, if you haven't had a chance, I hope you make a little time to go through it soon, because I think it lays out a lot of important lessons like this that are very useful for anybody out there organizing today. I think the lessons inside are as important today as they were over 100 years ago when the pamphlet was written. And I find myself time and time again revisiting this work, in particular whenever I have doubts or I'm unsure about what road to follow. Proletarian democracy and the Marxist movement in general, a movement of the 99% in support of the 99%, are unlike any other movements in the history of the world and unlike any other movements in the history of these ruling classes that have existed over the centuries. It's going to look different, and there's going to be some growing pains too. But the important thing is to ask, is it advancing the workers' cause forward? Is it advancing the group that I'm organizing with? Are we gaining new members? Are we having successful actions? That's going to tell you whether or not you're doing the right socialist thing or whether what you're doing needs some refinement. So I want everybody who's unsure about organizing to keep doing what you're doing and step it up. I think it's important to keep calling these rallies we see out there, to organize that socially distanced car caravan for the cause, promoting that call-in day, hosting write-ins and email-ins to the people who can make change. We expect those on the right to continue to criticize us, but when those on the left criticize us, people that we think should be out in the streets or who should be more closely aligned with us, we can use the lessons in this pamphlet to reassure ourselves of what we're doing and to help maybe even win over some of those people from the sidelines and put them in the fight. I think that was part of the reason why Lenin wrote his pamphlet in the first place, was to keep people from trending into this sideline mentality of sitting by the wayside and criticizing things and saying, no, you need to be involved, and that's how you're going to be able to express the right line. That's how you're going to be able to express the right action. And I think that's really important. We can use the lessons in this pamphlet to reassure ourselves of what we're doing and what class we're serving. So I hope this discussion is interesting to folks and helpful, and I appreciate your time this afternoon. I think it's very important for people to continue fighting for justice out there in the streets, in the workplaces, in the schools, in your neighborhoods. And I just wanted to once again say I appreciate everybody's time and solidarity forever to all of you out there. Now we're going to take a look at a couple of questions that folks have sent in during this discussion. So I see a question. Are there some other Soviet theoreticians that just really got it wrong? And I think there are a lot of people out there that got it wrong. I'm not quite remembering his nationality, but I remember reading various works by Bukharin and Kropotkin. That's the one I was thinking of when I was in college, and people who were analyzing things about anarchism and socialism. People like, of course, the infamous Leon Trotsky, who was definitely a major bedfellow of Karl Kautsky, criticizing the Soviet Union and everything that they thought it was doing wrong. And I think that we see that same sort of criticism, that same sort of people sitting on the sideline criticizing things that the government is doing in Cuba or in China. And I think first and foremost, it's really our responsibility to analyze our own situation and our own government, our own actions first before we look at what other places are doing. I think that's an important part of internationalism, which is something that Lenin touches on in this pamphlet. But I think that you can really make a good litmus test of who was a good theoretician and who was a bad theoretician by what they were able to do and what they were able to accomplish, given their circumstances and given the time. You know, folks like Lenin and Stalin go on to help grow the Soviet Union, where people like Trotsky and Kropotkin and others basically just keep on writing and writing and writing, and sometimes organizing for the wrong side up until the very end. So I think that's an important question to go over. If you want, good advice on who the theoreticians are, you should read. Look at the places that had successful revolutions, and I think you'll find a lot of useful information there. So I see another question that asks, how do you redirect critics when you're in an organizing meeting? I think that there's a very tactful way you can go about it, right? There's a very ham-fisted way where you try to shut them down. But depending on how sincere you think they are, I think there's a way to go about it where you can actually draw them in closer to the mission of the meeting, whether that's planning a rally or some sort of event that advances your campaign. So for example, you might be having a meeting about fighting police crimes. And something I hear come up a lot is, well, what about supporting Black businesses? And, I'm of the opinion that while we do want to support Black businesses, that's not going to get us to socialism. That's not going to get us to revolution. And that's also not going to benefit the overwhelming majority of people, white, Latino, Black, or whatever nationality they might be. So we would take a question like that and say, that's a good idea. Can you help us find a way to incorporate that into what we're doing? But remember, at the end of the day, what we're doing is protesting these police killings, this brutality out there in the community, and sending a few extra dollars to this business or that isn't really going to make the kind of change that we're trying to see, whether that's indicting killer cops, sending them to jail, or trying to win some justice for the families that are suffering. So I think there's a way to reorient critics in meetings to actually draw them in a little closer to what they're doing, and maybe give them some tasks that help them develop their own organizing skills. And I believe that in the long run, if you do this, people will be able to analyze their previous positions as being a little bit more backwards than the new positions that they're taking or that they're exercising with your group in practice. So that's a great question. I see another question that says, how do you think a dictatorship of the proletariat will handle people who were previously supportive of a revolution but don't support the dictatorship of the proletariat as it exists? For example, anarchists who believe in overthrowing capitalism but would also protest a worker state once it's built. I think that we're going to see a lot of people like that. If there's one thing that a revolution does, it's force people to choose sides. And I think in those kind of a situations where you have real questions of power that you're struggling over, it's important to put that question out to the conscious element, to people who have been reading socialist works and reading about the theory of revolution. Put that question out there. Are you with us or are you against us? And I think in a lot of ways, this pamphlet is an example of Lenin asking that question to Karl Kautsky and getting an answer that Karl Kautsky would rather be critical of the success of the revolution and not participate in building the dictatorship of the proletariat. And he would rather sit on the sidelines. It's important to think of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a process as well as a state of being, right? It's not just something that we snap our fingers to make come into existence. Much like our own formation as revolutionaries and as theoreticians, we have to grow the thing. And so I think, and I hope that we're able to appeal to other forces in such a situation and get them to come on board. And that's got to be our goal. But at the end of the day, we do have to ask the question, whose side are you on? Like the famous song says. And I see another question. How can we encourage those who are fearful of conflict to take bolder stances and tactics when the situation calls for it? I think that the first thing you have to do is meet people where they're at. There's a wonderful pamphlet by Freedom Road Socialist Organization called Some Points on the Mass Line that tells us it's a great idea to start where people are at and go from there. So, for example, much like we have to crawl before we can walk, before we can, go occupy City Hall and hold a sit-in until we get our demands. Maybe the first step that we can encourage people to participate in is a call-in day or an email writing campaign. Maybe we can give these same people who are fearful of conflict some tasks leading up to these kind of more basic starting events that help to build their confidence so that they can take those bold actions when the time is right. Nobody here wants to call a really hardcore action that has 3 people come out to participate in. We want to see as many people out there participating as possible. And so it's important to meet people where they're at. Perhaps you're in a city that's organizing folks who come from a largely religious background. In such a situation, if people want to hold something like a time of prayer during the action, we want to allow people space to be able to begin where they're at and, try to draw them further along as time goes on. So I think that's a very good question. It's a very important part of what we do. And I can think of a lot of organizers that I've met over the years that began at a place where they may have felt very timid when it came to organizing, and now they're out there leading protests that are bigger than anything I've ever led myself or participated in myself. So I think it's a process that begins where people are at and not where you want them to be, right? You want to have that end goal in mind of holding the big sit-in, of having the 10,000 person, 100,000 person march, but you want to start where people are at and summate as at the close of each action. You want to summarize what went well and what went wrong to help build that confidence in people's organizing ability and in their groups, in their comrades, etc. So I appreciate that question. The last question I'm going to take today asks if there are other works by Lenin that we should read. I think he wrote a lot of great books. Some of the big ones that I've gone to time and time again and that I would recommend to others are The State and Revolution, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and his writings on the national question, which I think had a big influence on other figures in the movement like Harry Haywood, who wrote about the national question as it pertains to the United States, particularly in the Black Belt South, where a huge majority of the Black people in the United States still live today. So I appreciate these questions and think that they were good. They helped me to think about things in a new light. And I appreciate everybody's time participating in this discussion. Before I go, I do want to mention that people should try and join the marches on the DNC and the RNC. I know my friend's going to post some links in the chat. The DNC is happening very soon in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the RNC, unfortunately, is happening here in Jacksonville, Florida. Nobody wants to see Trump come to their city and raise hell, but I promise you this: we're going to raise even more hell as we protest the RNC here in Jacksonville, Florida, at the end of August. And I'd also encourage anybody that's interested in joining the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, go to FRSO.com/join and sign up. Someone will reach out to you. And there's never been a better time to get involved. Reading is really a foundational part of being a successful activist. but by grouping together and forming organizations, we can magnify our own impact on society and on politics tenfold and reach new horizons that we would have never been able to reach on our own. You know, that's why we focus so much on organizing the working class, on the broad masses of people, on all the oppressed people and oppressed nations and all over the world, and not just on, you know, enriching our own theoretical understanding of things, right? So we want to read, we want to put things into practice, and then analyze and summarize how that impacts what we thought before and what we think now. And that really helps you to develop your own campaigns and gain new wins for the working class. So I appreciate everybody's time. I really recommend you, if you haven't had a chance yet, to check out Lenin's famous pamphlet, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a good evening.